This is the decisional system that's in place to create a world like Dune. Not too hard, is it? Could be easily achieved by anyone, no? Let's break it down to the detail. Hi, Theo here, and I shall perform a narrative autopsy on Dune 1 and 2, the movies, with the aim not to mainly look at lore, but at how the characters, the world, and the plots are built and developed to achieve such a story. A large amount of spoilers may be ahead. Proceed with caution. In most epics, prophecy emerges from the divine. In Dune, prophecy emerges from politics. With this in mind, we begin with stage 1, by looking at the world where the action happens. For thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit seeded myth around the galaxy. Stories of a coming messiah, rituals promising salvation, signs waiting for the right bloodline to appear. This isn't destiny, this is cultural engineering at its finest. Part 1 shows this invisible machine, factions competing for power, a desert hostile to human life, and an oppressed people desperate for hope. Part 2 activates the machine built in Part 1. The Freemen begin interpreting every action Paul takes as confirmation of their political prophecy. This aligns very well with Jonathan Goshal's idea from the storytelling animal. Humans don't just believe stories, we search for stories to believe in. Okay, so what do we have this far? We're looking at a world where we define the main twist, prophecy from politics, not from the divine. We have an order that has propagated this aesthetic of the mythic, and a large machine that's at first being created, and in the second being placed in motion. Fairly easy, right? Moving on. Let's dive into stage 2, character engine, Paul Atreides and his mirror characters. How do you create characters? Do you need 1, 2, 5? And what do those characters need to have to be believable? Let us begin with Paul Atreides, the protagonist, and slowly expand outwards until we manage to paint a more complete painting of the characters. In story, Robert McKee writes that a story begins when desire collides with resistance. For Paul, this desire is multifaceted and kind of consuming. Paul's transformation across Dune Part 1 and Part 2 is not a straight line. It's a collision between want and need, each evolving under pressure. When it comes to Part 1, Paul's want is survival and belonging. He wants to survive Arrakis, he wants to protect his mother, he wants a place among the freemen. These are external reactive desires, defined by circumstances. Paul's need, on the other hand, is about identity. He must understand who he is, what he believes, and whether he accepts the voice of prophecy or rejects it. In Campbell's language, this is the refusal to the call. Paul senses the destiny being placed upon him, but instinctively resists it. His want pushes him forward, his need pulls him backward. This tension creates complexity. By Part 2, Paul is no longer reacting, he is acting. He wants to lead, to avenge, to fulfill what the Freemen believe, and to control the storm he's caught inside. But he frames power as liberation, which makes the danger underneath. At this point, the need also shifts from identity towards accepting the identity he's found about. He must accept that there's no version of his destiny without bloodshed, prophecy will destroy him or consume the galaxy, and his rise is the beginning of a genocide he cannot stop. This is the Campbellian atonement with the father moment. The acceptance of truth that redefines the hero. The shift in Paul's want and need between the two films mirrors his psychological erosion. In Part 1, his want is small because he still believes he has agency. In Part 2, his want becomes enormous because he realizes he never had agency to begin with, but it happened for him to be the result of a prophecy that had agency. His need, meanwhile, evolves from personal identity to existential truth to tragic inevitability. This is the architecture of a tragedy disguised as a hero journey. Okay, Paul, so who are you and how are you built? He's no different than most heroes or villains or false heroes we see around. We begin by creating a small fella that has flaws and can't fit inside the world. We add some flaws to him and the world reacts to his flaws. If he's weak, the world crushes him. If he's arrogant, the world fights back. If he feels like he doesn't fit, he behaves and acts differently to those around him. This dynamic of Paul Atreides is a heavy balancing act. The traits he embodies are heavily influenced by and influencing the traits of the characters he surrounds himself with. In stories, characters usually are symbols of what the hero lacks, has too much of, needs to learn from, basically becoming cues about the hero's faith, trajectory, obstacles, so on and so forth. Let's start by looking at Chani, the moral conscience, the counter-myth mirror. Chani represents the world as it is, not as mythmakers describe it. She mirrors Paul's humanity. When Paul leans into prophecy, Chani pulls back. When Paul chooses destiny, Chani chooses reality. When Paul accepts power, Chani walks away. When it comes to narrative function, Chani's resistance reveals how far Paul strays from his need. She is the emotional contradiction that exposes Paul's growing moral blindness. By following Chani's reality, we can see the direction Paul takes regarding the story. Let's take a look at Jessica, the architect of destiny, the myth mirror. Jessica doesn't just reflect Paul, she shapes the narrative he moves through. She believes in the Bene Gesserit mission, she manipulates prophecy, she amplifies religious zeal, she weaponizes the Freeman's beliefs, she pushes Paul towards inevitability, not freedom. Jessica represents the external force of prophecy. She shows the audience that Paul is not choosing his destiny is being constructed around him. Her actions mirror the pressure building inside the structure of Paul's want. With the two ladies covered, let's take a look at our meme maker, Stilgar, belief incarnate, the myth follower mirror. Stilgar is the embodiment of prophecy fulfilled, not by truth, but by faith. Why does Stilgar decide he is ready to die? Because narrative prophecy logic dictates that the believer must sacrifice himself when the myth is no longer in need of his service. His role shifts from guide to disciple to zealot and to obsolete prophet. Stilgar's blind belief reflects something that serves as a heavy trigger within the narrative. How unstoppable the myth has become, how little choice Paul has left, and how prophecy consumes individuals. His willingness to die symbolizes the completion of myth internalization. The myth has reached full maturity. Paul can no longer escape it. And finally, let's take a look at Arrakis, the psychological crucible, or the setting. Arrakis mirrors Paul's inner world. Arrakis in part 1 is danger and trial, whilst Arrakis in part 2 is inevitability, exaltation, and destruction. The planet itself evolves alongside Paul, becoming the externalization of his internal conflict. When he becomes Muad'Dib, Arrakis becomes the world reshaped by prophecy, unstoppable, merciless, radiant, and tragic. What's the gig about this entire mirror character, anyway? Well, you build a character that has a set of wants and needs, a quest per se. What you do is the following. To make logic of the story, you create characters that embody variables that influence the main character. We have Paul that has his want and need, right? Now we create a handful of characters and based on their independent narrative threads, influence or showcase what the protagonist does. Not too hard, is it? Picture it like this. You create a character that has no skills in crafting, and you give them a mentor that has skills in crafting. You design a character that's afraid of water, you give them a mirror character that's a master of wielding and abusing the powers of water. Because we begin the concept of a protagonist from a need or flaws and directions, we can easily start to build the silhouettes of the mirror characters that basically embody parts of the character's lacks, needs, or direction. To this moment, we have established a bit about the moral, political, mythical world of the Dune, and some in-depth analysis of the characters, so we can safely migrate towards stage 3. Plot engine, the nested machinery, plots, subplots, and the machine of destiny. To understand Dune, we have to stop thinking of it as a single storyline, and start seeing it as basically a heavily immersive world, a machine built from multiple plot layers that all squeeze Paul Atreides towards one inevitable transformation. Every plot, every subplot, every character around him, they all function like gears. When one turns, all the others react to it. For the main plot, we have Paul's transformation arc. The main plot is simple on the surface. Paul goes from a boy with potential to a leader to something far more dangerous, a messiah who doesn't just inspire belief but weaponizes it. This is the spine of the story. It looks like a classic hero journey, but underneath it's a tragedy being built in slow motion. In parallel with this one, we have, let's say, subplot A, Chani versus the prophecy, the human counterforce. The first subplot is Chani, and she's essential. Chani is the voice of reality in a story drowning in myth. She doesn't believe in prophecy, she doesn't believe Paul is chosen, she believes in people, not legends. So when Paul leans into his supposed destiny, Chani becomes resistance. Her love pulls him towards humanity, her doubts pull him away from fanatic belief. And here's the important part. The more she resists the myth, the more Paul feels forced to embrace it. Chani doesn't just oppose what Paul becomes, she reveals it. For subplot B, we build the story of Jessica's Bene Gesserit agenda, the engine of destiny. Next we have Jessica, and if Chani is reality, Jessica is destiny. Jessica is not a passive character, she is a deliberate architect. She amplifies prophecy, she manipulates religious rituals, and she pushes the Freeman belief system into overdrive. She is the narrative force that turns myth into momentum. So, where Chani tries to pull Paul out of the myth, Jessica pushes him deeper into it. She represents the external pressure that shrinks Paul's agency. Every time Jessica strengthens the prophecy, Paul loses another inch of freedom. Subplot C, Stilgar and the Freeman belief, the acceleration gear. Then there's Stilgar, the embodiment of faith gaining speed. Stilgar begins as a mentor and warrior, but in part 2, he transforms into a zealot. Every sign becomes proof. Every coincidence becomes a miracle. Every action Paul takes confirms the legend. And this is where the plot architecture gets brilliant. As Stilgar radicalizes, there's no slowing the prophecy down. He becomes the symbol that belief itself is now unstoppable. Even if Paul wanted out, the myth no longer needs his consent. This is why Stilgar is prepared to die for the prophecy, because narratively, his arc fulfills the function of the prophet. Once the myth is complete, the prophet becomes obsolete. And subplot D, Empire and Harkonnens, the external pressure. And finally, the external subplot, the political war. The Harkonnens represent oppression, the Emperor represents control. This subplot doesn't just raise the stakes, it transforms Paul's decisions from personal to galactic. When the Empire becomes the enemy, Paul's internal struggle turns into a holy war. It's no longer about Arrakis, it's no longer about survival, it's about reshaping the entire galaxy, which is exactly what the prophecy warns about. How do these old plots intertwine? So here's the part I love. When we put these layers together, we don't get a simple story, we get a pressure system, a narrative machine. Imagine this diagram. Chani pulls Paul towards humanity. Jessica pushes him towards destiny, Stilgar accelerates belief, and the Empire forces political escalation, and Paul is in the center. Every subplot applies pressure on him from a different direction. Chani says, be human, Jessica says, be the prophecy, Stilgar says, be the Messiah, and the Empire says, be our enemy. And because all these gears turn at once, Paul's want and Paul's need finally collide. The collision is what transforms him, not a single moment, but the entire architecture of the plot pressing it until it breaks. And once the machinery is set in motion, there's no turning back. Because every symbol in Dune, every image, every ritual reinforces the path that Paul is now trapped on. Section 4. Symbolism and meaning. If Dune is a warning, why does it look like a hero story? Symbols in Dune are not flavor, they are narrative engines. Let's begin by looking at sand. In part 1, it's danger, the world rejecting Paul, whilst in part 2, it's inevitability, the world accepting him too much. How about water? Water is life, purity, memory, and later betrayal, as Chani watches prophecy corrupt Paul. The blue eyes, which are very specific to Dune, represent the transformation made visible, faith replacing identity. When it comes to characters, Chani is the counterweight to myth. She represents the human cost of prophecy. Her disillusionment mirrors our own. Jessica and the Bene Gesserit, the architects of destiny, human mythmakers masquerading as divine messengers. And the world itself, Arrakis. It's not just a setting, it's a psychological battlefield. The desert mirrors Paul's internal shift, vast, beautiful, merciless. Section 5. Climax. The birth of tragedy. At what point does a hero become something else? In part 1, Paul steps into the Freeman world believing he can shape his destiny. In part 2, destiny shapes him. This is the twist. His final transformation is not triumph, it's surrender. He accepts the mantle of Muad'Dib, he weaponizes prophecy, he sacrifices Chani, he sets a holy war in motion, he chooses power over peace. Paul becomes exactly what his father feared, a leader whose rise gives birth to destruction. This is the ultimate reversal, a monomyth turned inside out, a chosen one story that warns against chosen ones. Frank Herbert once said, "He who controls the myth controls the people." Paul loses himself by controlling too much. With all that being said, this is the decisional tree that's in place to create a story like Dune, from world building, characters, plots, and symbols. This is Theo. The narrative autopsy is done. Until we meet again.